has been to work with the witnesses. The very notion of dignity, we felt it throughout our interaction with all of the victims. It is not so much its scale, but the very nature of the crime that makes 1988 prison killings unbearable. The punishment is meted out not for an act, but for a thought. Victims or prisoners, their absolute lack of freedom, their total helplessness, their complete ignorance of the purpose of the questioning, and finally the silence that covers the secrecy of their killing are not only the ingredients that make for an abject political crime, but more importantly, they point to the worldview that informs a regime that rules over 70 million people. Secrecy and the banning of funeral and mourning, Hannah Arendt said, signify that the disappeared never actually existed. In fact, by refusing to acknowledge the mass killing of the political prisoners in 1988, the Islamic Republic denies their very existence, thus overrules the God who created them. Perhaps there is room only for one God in history. There is a message in this crime that should be taken seriously. Many of the victims had been in prison for years. They were killed because the authorities failed to shape their mind according to their own truth, a truth of which they are the historical embodiment. When the government is the sole possessor of the truth, there is no room for the fallibility of the rulers or the free will of the governed. So those who resist the government's truth must be eliminated. But if their elimination is public, then their resistance is public, and their death becomes the proof of their free will, hence the necessity of secrecy and silence. When the crime becomes public, the fallacy of the government truth is revealed. For those who died made a free choice and said no, while the government was forced to acknowledge their free will by the very act of killing them. But it is not easy to speak about evil. It is not easy to speak the unspeakable. One is paralyzed and muted by an intense feeling of shame and guilt. One is trapped in this silent crime. Life continues, but one does not live. Telling the truth becomes thus a heroic act. I pass the floor to Roya, who we have to recognize our hero of tonight. So, we have interviewed a lot of people about torture, and I think that we have become a bit torturers ourselves. We have learned a lot of skills, and one is to continue talking when people are exhausted. So if you bear one more minute, we will be done. So discussing this forgotten and unpunished crime was both necessary and overdue, and we're grateful to all of you for being here and bearing with us until now. The 1988 massacre is a significant episode of decades-long and systematic elimination of dissent in the Islamic Republic of Iran. Many among the victims of the 88 massacre were arrested during peaceful demonstrations in the early 1980s, held incommunicado, tortured and tried and sentenced arbitrarily, as were many protesters in the summer of 2009. In the 1980s, however, Iranians had no cell phones, computers, or internet to allow the world to bear witness and deter judges from trying and sentencing thousands to death. Hence, impunity became rule and the victims invisible. For us, documenting the truth about the 1988 massacre is a moral necessity and an important step to engage victims and survivors in a process that would sooner or later lead to some sort of remedy and a peaceful transition to democracy. It is also the only way for us to break the cycle of state violence and remind the perpetrator that there is no statute of limitation on what is unspeakable. This has been a long journey, and we have a long way to go.
Our efforts have been supported by generous funders. Some of them are here. Colleagues in the human rights community who worked before us and left documents and reports. Our colleagues in the Boroumand Foundation who are systematically tortured because the work is so difficult, and they have been relentless in documenting, in editing, in writing, in translating, and in helping us do what we do. And of course, none of our efforts would have succeeded without those who have the strength and the courage to testify, and those who helped us locate survivors. Among them, many are here. Many of those who have talked, who have testified, who have been in prison, and who have had the courage of coming forward are here in this room. Some here, I hope that they would be together, but they're not together. But among them, there are two who have been really relentless, instrumental and relentless in their work of documentation. And they are tireless, and they have been tireless since their release, since they left Iran. And so we thought that the least we could do is to recognize the work that they have done, because when they started to work in the 1990s, the world did not want to hear. The world was tired of bombings. The world was tired of hostage-taking. The world didn't want to hear. So they went unnoticed, but their efforts are paying off now. So I'm going to ask م.Baradarn and Monire. Ms.Baradarn. I'm tired, sorry. م.Baradarn and Ms.Mesdaghi are human rights activists and former political prisoners who belonged to different political groups when they were arrested in 1981. But their common denominator at the time was the rejection of the rule of the clergy. They are united now in their determination and persistence to ensure that the truth be known about Iranian prison conditions, and in particular the events of 1988. Monire was 21 when she was arrested. She was not married, but was in love. Like many other students in Iran, she joined an idealist leftist movement in the university. She was arrested in the fall of 1981 and was tortured during her interrogations and sentenced to 3 years imprisonment. 3 years later, she was tried once more, and this time she was sentenced to 10 years. Altogether, she spent 9 years in 3 different prisons in Tehran, where she was tortured regularly and bore witness to unspeakable acts of violence against fellow prisoners. Headstrong and unwavering in her beliefs, Monire was confined for a period of time in the coffins, literally wooden boxes that could fit only one sitting person, devised by prison authorities to break stubborn prisoners. Monire survived those terrible years with the power of her will and her determination to live and testify. Iraj began his political life in the United States with the Confederation of Iranian Students. He returned to Iran during the 1979 anti-monarchist revolution, and in 1981 was arrested because of his activities with the People Mujahideen of Iran. At 21, he was one of the older MEK prisoners who were mostly young students. One former prisoner, who was 13 at the time he was arrested and spent 10 years in prison, told us that Iraj became their mentor, a father figure, over the next decade in prison. In the face of systematic torture, he protected others while leading a soft war against the prison guards. He and thousands of others tried to assert their will and regain their dignity by protesting in any way they could. Many of Iraj's fellow prisoners were killed in the massacre. Those who were lucky to survive were often broken and became inactive. Iraj, however, never gave up and dedicated his life at a great cost for him and his family to document prison life and the 1988 massacre. Monire was released from prison in September 1990 and fled to Germany, where her love was still waiting. She wrote with great meticulousness about her ordeal in prison in Plain Truths, 3 volumes, which was translated into German. She is currently working on a book on truth commissions. She has become a fervent human rights advocate, determined to document the truth and seek justice for those who lost their lives during the massacre. She writes for a website, ms.Baradarn, The Awakened, which includes a virtual cemetery, Khavaran, honoring the victims of the 1988 massacre who are denied recognition and proper burial inside Iran. It was an honor to get to know her, and I'm glad that we have voice recorders now, because she speaks so fast that if we were to take notes, we would miss half of what she said. Iraj was also released from prison in 1990 and fled to Sweden, where he published his 3-volume memoir, Neither Life Nor Death, one of the most comprehensive works by a former prisoner. Currently an independent activist and researcher working on human rights, workers' rights, and prison issues, he also published Hell on Earth and a collection of prison songs. بر ساقه تابیده بر ساقه تابیده کنف about the prison massacre of 1998. Iraj is relentless in seeking the truth and following perpetrators. It was an honor to meet him, and working with him was a lesson in precision, because you can't be wrong with Iraj. Even the smallest details, like the color of the car of the delegation, this delegation, would make him very unsettled. So he was instrumental in making this report accurate. So thank you to both and to your collaboration.
We will give the prize, and then each of the laureates will. This is from Monire.
So we will start with Monire. We have picked something very small so that it's easy to carry in the plane. But we have a smaller version. And so the same. We are not responsible for carrying it, but we have a smaller version that you can. They're gonna say a few words, each of them. And let me go out of this. You have your
ترجمه می‌کنی؟
مترجممون
هستن. حالا من که
This is the other way around.
تون حرف میزنم از این جهت مشکلی نیستش. کوتاه هم صحبت میکنم. دوست داشتم یکم بیشتر باشه، ولی میدونم همه شما خسته هستیم. کوتاه صحبت میکنم.
دست شما در نکنه.
آره پس بعد از این تشکر از لادن و رویا برومند.
Thank you to Ladan and Roya
و دیگر همکاران برومند.
and all the other colleagues at Boroumand.
All the ABF team, ABF.
اینا همه دوستان من هستن.
They're all my friends.
من دوست دارم که اینجا این قدردانی که از من شد سهیم بشم.
I want to share this gratitude that's been shown to me
با زندانیان سیاسی که اینجا هستن.
with the political prisoners who are here.
هم دوره من بودن.
They were my colleagues.
و به ویژه
And in particular,
زنانی که با من همبندی
the
بودن.
women who were in my group and myself.
اگه اجازه بدین اسمشون دوست دارم ببرم.
And if it's permitted, I'd like to mention their names.
هایده میخوام اسم ببرم، مریم،
هایده،
شراره،
مریم، شراره،
راضیه،
مهناز، افت.
مریم هم گفتم، مریم هم نگفتم. ما میدونیم ما روزهای سخت زندان رو با دوستی ها و همبستگی
The difficult days in prison we spent together in solidarity with each other.
به هم کمک کردیم
We
که
helped each other
اون روزهای سخت رو بگذرونیم.
to get over the difficult days.
امسال 30 سال از اون روزهایی که من دستگیر شدم میگذره. درست همین روزها من دستگیر شدم.
It's about these days 30 years ago that I was arrested.
و یکم دیرتر در اواخر پاییز
And towards the end of autumn
من از طریق شنیدن شاهد اعدام برادرم بودم.